Okay, that was Mushoku Tensei, Season 1, Episode 17. I don't know what to say, man. That was such a great episode. I have so many feelings. It took me through, the whole range of emotions, and there was not a bit of action in it. And that's why I love the show.
Because
it's great.
If you're going to have a dialogue-heavy and emotional-heavy episode, one of the most satisfying things to witness characters or real people go through, or to experience yourself in your real life, is healthy communication. Even if it's hard, if you want to say something else that's maybe a little bit more, almost like you're getting an edge up on the person, or a little more self-serving, but to have healthy communication where you're vulnerable to that person and you're willing to kind of rebuild together and realize what intentions are.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can people have different ways of trying to cheer up other people. People have different ways of expressing their own feelings. And, it can be, if you're very in your head, it can be hard to read that all the time.
Yeah.
And you could totally be confused about what someone is intending to say to you and what they're intending to do to you. You could think they're trying to be malicious when really they're just trying to cheer you up, or not. Maybe he's not owning up to it. No, he's maybe trying to make light of it because this is an awkward situation.
Yeah. Number 1, the writing's insane.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, I am so happy that they didn't just the whole second meeting, right? Let's act like yesterday never happened. I'm so glad that wasn't how it went down.
Mm-hmm.
In hindsight, it gave us everything, right? It gave us a little bit of a father-son rematch in the beginning of it.
Mm-hmm.
It gave depth and complexity to each of their characters, and it gave growth to each of their characters. And rarely do you see in this kind of work is self-reflection, especially immediately after the fact. I think it's so interesting that on one hand, Geese was the one to help that reflection come about within Paul, but I really think that Paul's conversation with Rudy helped Rudy in such a profound way that I just didn't expect it. I thought that maybe they'd play it like Rudy had some sense of being right, or so, whenever the conversation would have ended, it wasn't going to be as leaning in towards Rudy's actual past life and what he has been doing. And yeah, Guy said it himself, the demon continent has been hell, and he could have been saying things in a way of not to make Paul worry, but there was a little bit of truth there that Rudy can grasp onto, and he didn't need to, right? Mm-hmm. In that situation, he could have just yup, you're sorry, I forgive you, we're all good. But the owning up to that mistake and really putting yourself all in is what is needed for actual growth to occur. And that is so refreshing to see in a story. That's so cool.
I mean, Geese obviously was kind of very influential to this interaction actually happening. Both interactions, actually, because I remember us being like, why is Geese not entering the city with them?
Yeah.
It's obvious that he wanted Rudy and Paul to have a reuniting moment themselves.
Yeah.
Because it's obvious he knew about Rudy and knew that Paul was looking for Rudy, and he pointed Rudy in the right direction.
Where did I hear that name before, you know? Yeah.
And then to have this here, he kind of takes another step, and it's clear, obviously, that this is a good friend that is able to be honest with Paul. And honestly, it was really nice to see Paul kind of deal with this honesty and critique at him in the state that he was in, and not blow up at his friend. And because he could tell, even if he was a little bit in denial with what he was quipping back at Geese, he could tell that Geese was trying to help. And he didn't get up and storm off. He didn't punch Geese in the face. There were a few moments that I'm like, if someone is really drunk and really upset and angry about this, they could totally attack you right now for what you're saying. And so I really liked Geese for that.
I wonder when Paul and Geese met, because if we imagined how this would have played out if the day that everything changed, Norn and Paul ran into Rudy, their interactions with each other would have been vastly different. Mm-hmm. And it takes somebody, I think, to know what Paul is really like, to be able to say what needs to be said, to give them a sense of what their reality would have been before everything you've gone through and all the horrific mental spot that you're in right now because of all the failure that you could consider you not finding your family to be.
The most hard-hitting
Oh my
kind of
God.
point that Geese brought up
Mhm.
was almost like, would you rather he have been dead?
N-
Like,
it
or
was
like injured,
the
or have gone
language.
through hell?
Would
Yeah, I don't
you-
remember exactly
Would you
what the
rather have
dialogue
a
was.
dead-eyed son who has
Mhm.
lost a piece from himself?
Has a missing piece.
And I was
Is
like,
that what you would rather right now?
it was so good,
Because
man.
and it shows the layer of why Paul was upset to begin with. There's resentment, there's jealousy, there's just frustration. There's still this scared fear that you want someone on your team in support of you. Are they thinking about your other family members too? And also he's also the father figure, like, and he has this responsibility to take care of Rudy too, and to have found Rudy, and all of this just in this pot inside of a skull that is also drinking alcohol a lot and really stressed out and working
Yeah.
really hard to be a leader
Mhm.
of finding and saving people, and then also taking care of a small child.
I could be off here, but and apologies if I am, but this is the first time I remember at the moment learning that Paul had never been to the demon continent. And I think that paired with the beginning, like the opening of this episode with the montage of Paul's journey, it was so smart that if that is actually the first time I heard that they waited to pair it with that until this episode,
Mhm.
after that interaction and altercation between the two, because it puts Paul in a position of, like, I could have easily misread his actual intention and personality last episode, but I think this shows how much pain he actually is in. If he isn't even thinking, oh, I've never even been there and Rudy's
Yeah.
been there. He's just making these vast assumptions.
Mhm. I think it's really smart to bring up kind of that it expands upon and reinforces an idea you might have had about how Paul felt and what he went through.
Yeah.
Like, if you didn't leave last episode with an understanding of that, which I think you possibly could have,
Yeah.
maybe inferred or started to assume what you thought was going on in Paul's head. But obviously with this, you kind of just added another layer to it of understanding. So I did want to, like, talk about that in terms of, like, episode structure. Plot-wise, it's not integral to driving the plot. It only just enhances an understanding of one character that interacts with the main character's intentions and feelings, and could also just make things feel a little fuller for you. So I thought that the pacing of this episode is interesting because it was so enjoyable.
Yeah.
But there was one big plot point that happened at the very end, and we got kind of some extra stuff.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel like it was just fluff.
We learned a decent amount of information too throughout this episode that was just like, I could have easily ignored and not wanted to talk about more, but because, like, I'm writing notes and stuff, I get to. The fact that Geese is from the demon continent is extremely interesting to me. In my knowledge of, like, other literary works or television series, it makes me a little worried about him in the long run, regardless of everything this episode telling us otherwise, because it's like, and it could end up being like a positive thing too, but it seems like they aren't letting us off the hook with Geese yet.
Mhm.
There's more for that character to be explored within, and I want, like, it's like a breadcrumb,
Especially
that
that little
easily pay
moment
off.
he has with Paul at the end where he says where specifically he's going to go, and
Yeah.
that place hasn't been checked. Yeah, I really liked this episode. I felt like it made me think of how some people might view this as if someone were to ask you, hey, like, cut up this episode, you can only have a 10-minute episode instead of a 23-minute episode, or however long it is. You know, unfortunately, you probably would have just maybe given a little bit of Geese's conversation with Paul, and then you would have just shown their conversation.
It would have
with the
been
two of
so
them.
much worse,
And-
man. I know what you
But
mean,
if you
though.
hadn't had that other stuff, I don't know if you would have felt, I think you would have felt like, I need to guess what he's thinking a little bit more, and we wouldn't have had the foreshadowing that Paul was going to shave, possibly, that made that reveal for Rudy even better for us to witness.
Yeah.
So it's like everything that we got at the beginning of this episode made the end of the episode fuller, more satisfying, and made everything just feel a lot smoother and right. That if someone asked you to edit it, I don't even know if you might have just had question marks. But
It's like-
that's not a bad thing. I'm
like,
just saying I liked it.
Yeah. I've
And it's
touched on it
interesting to
before,
me.
like some some books especially will have point of view chapters of characters, and because of that, I think the story itself is more enriching at the end of the day. And that's kind of how I looked at what we got from Paul this episode. They could have easily played it as just Rudy's dad, right? They already have so much of an emphasis that this character has a disconnect from this family in a way because he's lived a previous life.
Yeah.
We didn't need that in terms of anime, but God, it's so much better.
I think that's what I'm trying to say, is that we didn't need to know how Paul felt or thought, because we're following Rudy, and what truly matters at the end of the day is probably how Rudy feels, and whatever is in front of Rudy and how it's harder to write it and to enrich and fulfill the conversation that happens later, to make it all just hit way more and be way more emotional. It was definitely necessary if you were going to try to go an emotional route with things. I wrote down the word game. Because in that conversation with Paul, it starts off kind of as if Rudy is still playing somewhat of a game, talking to an NPC or a character within a game that he's not truly trying to connect to. And he is just like, yeah, I apologize, you're right. And until he looks into his father's face, does he realize and start speaking from his heart.
I think that he assumed, right? Based off of the conversation yesterday and what he has known. And then, God, the shopkeep.
He was also going off of the words that were being said and only just that.
Yeah.
Maybe even the tone, but there's something so...
I did want to talk a little bit about the lead up to that conversation, if I may. I wonder if at all anything is genetic if you are reincarnated. As a sidebar, other than looks, right? Or physical prowess. I wonder if there's any emotional connection that could further that. Seeing one of the most powerful scenes this episode to me was Paul visualizing Rudy being there. Being there as if he had always been there with Norn, what he'd act like now, or being there if he did show up, a dead-eyed son who had lost a piece of himself. Mm-hmm. And it put Paul into a sort of a panic attack, which reminded me of Rudy last episode. And I was it was so strong for me. When he walked up into the bar, another one of my favorite scenes this episode is that Eris was not looking at Paul at all when he walked in. Eris literally saw a micro expression of Rudy's face. Expressions in the show are nuts, but just off of that, just that little flinch, right? She went immediate defensive, and I loved that. I loved it so much. It was so good.
I think that we've been getting a lot of evidence, especially after last episode. I think last episode and this episode are almost to drive home, hey, if you haven't noticed, Eris cares as much about protecting Rudy as Rudy cares about Eris.
Yeah.
If you haven't noticed that she also thinks about him and considers him, Yeah. That they both tried to get each other out of the demon continent. When Eris in this episode basically admits, oh yeah, I already know that it's probable that my home is gone and people in my life are also missing. I
didn't expect her to say that.
I think that is another example of wow, have I, like Rudy in that scene, been slightly underestimating exactly how much fun and game Eris was seeming to have, which is similar to how Paul was perceiving Rudy talking about his journey, was that it was all fun and games. And really, it just makes you think wow, these two kids, these two preteen children protected each other and were each other's teammates and supports through this entire thing.
It's such a fine line because they're trying to make the most out of the circumstances that they're in, but treading that can easily cross over to having too much fun. It's a game, but at the end of the day, it's if you're having to go through all of this shit and all of this hell, traversing these vast deserts with no water, hey man, your outlook on your life and being with friends can definitely make a difference, actually, in survival,
Is it possible that you had to play a game and had to find the fun in it in order to actually survive?
Yeah,
and
or
not
keep
be
a part of
dead-eyed
yourself.
And not miss a part of yourself? Especially, if you think on, the simplest terms. Sometimes, even for adults, not just children, if you have a really sucky chore that you really don't want to do and it's really gross and you have to clean something, making a game out of it makes it so much easier to go through.
Yeah.
And to be thinking, if he was going and traversing the demon continent in that whole way, being depressed, negative, a killjoy, basically, would he have amounted to anything that he amounted to on the demon continent?
God, it was so good.
He used his charm to get most of the way through the demon continent.
What did you think about like Rudy like expressing and like saying out loud that he himself he did have it easy? Those were his lines. Where do you read into that? Do you like wholeheartedly believe him when he says it was easy, or do you think that he's saying that he had it easy because he was treating it? It was like a result of him treating it like a game and being lighthearted about it.
That's an interesting way to go with it. So I think I have 2 points.
Okay.
So it does make it a lot easier than the person that's struggling through it, drinking through it, obviously not sleeping through it. You obviously did have it easier than that person if you were trying to end your day with a smile and trying to be positive. You know, you are going to probably think that you had it a little easier because every step, when you're depressed and sad, every step is like you just climbed a mountain. But if you are trying your best to be positive, it probably would seem easier. So that's, I guess, one part of that. The other part that I really want, because that was the real question you were asking, is do I believe that he really feels that way? I find that anything that he said to Paul before he looked at Paul's face, I don't think it could actually be like chucked out the window or anything, but it definitely needs to be taken with like you either need to read into this a little bit more about what he's intending to do to Paul with saying this. Is he trying to take his father's worries away again? What's he trying to do here? Because obviously he hasn't faced up to even looking at his father's face yet.
Yeah.
So I can't believe that everything he says before that is the true, vulnerable, and real feelings that are no intention at all to make Paul feel a certain way.
I agree. I think it's really smart that you brought up it was before the eyes met too. And the last thing I wanted to touch upon, like in terms of like that trying to be positive, trying to have fun, the one thing that you do, whether it's conscious or not, is you're ignoring and avoiding the things that would make you sad. That could be part of the reason that, I know obviously other things came up, but in a different scenario, it could be a way that you ignore a bulletin board. It could be a way that, you know, you can, in a real person's life, you could avoid things that are hard to deal with if you're just trying to be.
You're coping with your circumstances. I mean. Yeah.
Okay. How crazy is it that like towns are vanishing? Not just like people.
It was a crater.
Yeah.
Was that supposed to be hometown or Fatoa?
I think that the message is that
it was a significant place with a significant amount of people. I don't think it really. I almost, I guess, pictured the disaster as being somewhat of a tornado that kind of touched down and swept maybe like a couple people from this city, a couple people from that city, and kind of dispersed them. I guess that's how I thought of it, and not maybe the gravity that we got. I think Paul's scene in the beginning of this episode, I think for the viewer, we were still kind of in Rudy's boat last episode of kind of his understanding of the gravity. And then in this episode, not only do we get that visual of the crater, but we get told by him, oh wait, you know, you were planning on taking Eris back to her family. Why did you assume that Eris's family, other than you know that Soros is dead, the viewer, is okay, and that you can take her back to her home that's still standing? And I'm like, yeah, why was I thinking that we could just take Eris back to her
In my
home?
mind, I thought it was like a rapture. Like, I thought just, like, people were transported.
Like, random.
What? No, like, just people. No buildings. There was no destruction to land. And now I'm like, it's a goddamn miracle that anybody is alive.
I know.
It's like, if somebody caused the Mana disaster in my mind, somebody just as powerful and strong needed to be able to reach their hand in and make sure the living survived.
Okay, good question that I have to ask you now then, because of what you just said. What are the odds in terms of what we have now learned, the gravity? Does it make sense for this story that everyone is actually alive in the family?
Well, maybe at first, but I don't know about afterwards, you know?
What do you mean by at first
like,
or not
after the disaster, I think that probably they were alive, but then
whatever they might have gone through.
Correct.
So okay, I think that's a good question to be bringing up is like, well, we don't want to come into this show being too maybe optimistic because we're learning, wait, you were optimistic that Eris's family was like not affected by this. So I take by that, oh, I shouldn't be assuming that anyone's actually even alive.
So I have a question for you. Do you take Soros being in front of that council as he was transported somewhere where he was able to quickly get in front of a council? Or do you think it was orchestrated by the council? Or do you think it's kind of like, oh my God, this country's under attack. Let's get all of our nobles into a place to discuss it and then, kill them if based off of how they even handled the disaster. How are you supposed to handle this disaster if in a blink of an eye everything's gone? Including you and your every building around you. So
there's I guess two possibilities to me of how that transpired, how he got into that building. Either he wasn't swept up in the disaster, and he ended up going and being invited to that place to have a conversation, unknowing that it was going to be his death.
Yeah.
And then the other scenario is that he also got swept up and they sent out, obviously probably had a lot of means, really rich, probably had knights to search for him specifically.
True.
To bring him in under the guise that no one knows because he was missing and no one knows where he is.
Yeah.
Because according to Paul, he's missing. Yeah. Soros is missing too.
Yeah.
So I think that's also an idea that they found him first and killed him and swept it under the rug. Oh, he must have died. What if they just Soros must have died because he ended up on the demon continent.
It opens up so many different doors.
They could literally just get away with murder.
It's crazy because it feels like they've given us just enough information to be skeptical and suspicious, but not enough information to theory craft. You know what I mean? In regards to that other side of the story. Because I feel like we don't have enough about Man God or the other gods. We don't know.
How suspicious of Man God should we be?
Yeah, I have no idea. My last thing, I guess, is more of a theory or a headcanon.
Okay.
I think that the barkeep is the father of geese. You don't,
That'd be so funny.
It has to be genetic to be able to help these people and families like this, you know?
And to know exactly what to say or do. I would say that it's very interesting. There are 3 very wise adult characters in this episode that almost, for some reason, all of them are masters at healthy communication style and loving your family.
Geese, barkeep, and Ruijerd.
Yeah. I'm okay, all 3 of you are just really well versed in how to treat your family member and have a reunion, have reconciliation, forgiveness.
How cool was it that Paul acknowledged Ruijerd and not as a superb, but he could tell the type of person he was just based off of a few words in their first interaction. That was awesome to me. I'm so glad that happened. I'm hopeful that we do see everybody again and that Norn, the next time we see each other isn't 30 years from now and Norn's still pissed at Rudy.
I know when they said at the very end of the episode, oh, are you okay with the fact that you may never see your dad again?
Yeah.
I was oh my gosh, yeah, that's really what this parting of ways is you're both separately going to look for your family, but you don't know. I mean, you're still an adventurer. There's still monsters out there. There's still villains and smugglers out there.
Yeah.
Could you survive every single trial that's going to come your way? And then obviously Norn's the only thing about this episode that I'm obviously in the silliest and not actual real way. I'm I wish Norn had hugged him before he left. But no, it's much better this way to have her still be, because she's an individual.
Yeah.
We can't just have a happy ending rainbows, butterflies, tie a bow. She's gonna forgive Rudy for punching her dad that basically is her hero. No.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also not going to forget Vieira and Shiera, who are probably siblings.
I know, and their personalities are so opposite.
Yeah. All right, That's all I have. You?
Yes.
Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and we hope to see you next time.
Well, we don't want to come into this show being too maybe optimistic that Well, we don't want to come into this show being too maybe optimistic.
Well, we don't want to come into this show being too maybe optimistic.